What if the one who walks away in silence is the one who feels the most, but understands it the least? The avoidant individual, at first glance, appears untouched by the silence of no contact. There is a calmness, a confidence, a sense that they are managing just fine without emotional closeness. But this exterior is a well-practiced defense, a mask constructed over many years to protect the fragile self that fears dependence. Beneath this hardened surface lies a deeply rooted illusion, the belief that they do not need others to feel whole, that detachment is strength, and that needing someone is a flaw rather than a natural human state. When no contact is initiated, especially by someone they have emotionally bonded with, even if only in fragments, the first cracks begin to appear in that illusion. The silence does not merely signify distance. It acts as a mirror, reflecting back to them a truth they've long tried to suppress. The illusion of independence starts to collapse, not because they suddenly recognize their dependency, but because the absence unsettles something primal. Something unconscious begins to stir. There's no one on the other end validating their emotional distance anymore. No one left to push away. The game of avoidant detachment loses its player. As the days stretch without contact, the avoidant may not consciously yearn for the other person, but they begin to feel an unease that is difficult to name. It might come as restlessness, irritability, or a strange sense of hollowness that seems to echo louder in the quiet. They may tell themselves that they are finally at peace, that the space is what they needed, but their psyche whispers a different truth. They may find themselves going over past conversations, or checking the other person's presence online, not out of overt longing, but from a subtle compulsion to maintain a connection they claim they didn't want. What's really happening is that the silence is dismantling their protective narrative. The emotional armor they've worn for years begins to feel heavy, unnecessary, and even isolating. They may not know how to express this realization, but it manifests through internal conflict, uncertainty, and contradictory behaviors. The illusion that they are fully self-contained begins to fray. The emotional autonomy they cherished reveals itself not as freedom, but as fear disguised. The avoidance unconscious begins to confront the possibility that independence has become a wall, not just from others, but from their own emotional world. What no contact does, at its most profound level, is force the avoidant to sit with themselves in a way they have avoided all their lives. The absence of the other becomes a confrontation with the self, and while they may not speak of it, nor show any outward sign, the internal structure they built on detachment begins to tremble. In this quiet collapse, something long buried begins to awaken, something raw, something real, and something they can no longer ignore. Avoidants are often misunderstood because their external behavior rarely matches their internal experience. During no contact, they may appear composed, even indifferent, as though the separation barely registers on their emotional radar. They may go about their day as usual, maintaining routines, engaging in distractions, and convincing themselves that the distance is a relief. To the outside world, they project an image of someone in control, unbothered, and emotionally self-sufficient. But beneath this outer calm is a terrain filled with unprocessed emotion, subtle anxiety, and psychological conflict. The avoidant doesn't show their pain, not because it isn't there, but because they have spent their lives mastering the art of emotional suppression. That suppression doesn't eliminate their emotions, it only buries them deeper in the unconscious, where they continue to influence thoughts, behaviors, and choices without ever being acknowledged. When silence stretches, and there is no opportunity to subtly push away or control the narrative with the other person. Avoidants begin to experience an unfamiliar discomfort. They are left alone with themselves, and this is precisely where their hidden turmoil surfaces. Thoughts begin to circulate, questions about what went wrong, why they feel unsettled, and whether they pushed away someone who genuinely cared. These reflections rarely emerge as clear or direct. Instead, they manifest through vague irritability, a loss of focus, or a haunting sense that something is missing. The avoidant may not know how to label these sensations, but they feel them. The emotional energy they spent trying to stay in control becomes a source of internal pressure. Their psyche begins to rebel against the neat, rational narrative they've tried to enforce. This internal turmoil is complicated by the avoidant's deep resistance to vulnerability. Even when emotional discomfort becomes overwhelming, they do not allow themselves to cry, reach out, or admit they miss someone. Instead, the conflict simmers inside. They might throw themselves into work, social obligations, or solitary hobbies, but the quiet moments, the ones before sleep or during idle silence, betray them. Memories resurface without warning. The sound of a voice, the flash of a look, or a shared joke revisits them like ghosts. These emotional flashbacks are not welcomed, but also not entirely ignored. They linger just below the surface, refusing to be fully dismissed. In these moments, the avoidant becomes a silent battleground of competing instincts. On one side, the urge to remain distant and untethered. On the other, the undeniable evidence of emotional attachment that refuses to be erased by time or logic. The inner turmoil grows not because they are weak, but because the unconscious truth, the one they've suppressed for so long, begins to rise. The silence of no contact removes distractions and forces the avoidant to meet themselves, perhaps for the first time. And what they find is not a serene, emotionally invincible self, but a fractured, conflicted being who craves connection more deeply than they've ever allowed themselves to admit. When no contact begins, it doesn't just represent the loss of a current relationship for the avoidant, it awakens something far more ancient and buried. Deep in the unconscious lie unhealed wounds from early childhood, often born in environments where love was inconsistent, conditional, or unsafe. These wounds are not memories in the traditional sense. They are patterns, instincts, emotional blueprints that were formed long before language. The avoidant learned early on that closeness meant danger, either through suffocating enmeshment, emotional neglect, or rejection when vulnerability was shown. As a result, they adapted by disconnecting from their feelings, detaching from those around them, and building a fortress around the self. But no contact tears at the edges of that fortress. In the silence, without distraction or control over the relationship, these suppressed wounds begin to resurface. The avoidant may not realize that their distress isn't just about the person they've separated from. It's about what that separation symbolizes. It mirrors the original experience of abandonment or emotional overwhelm that they never got to process. Something in their psyche begins to panic, but the panic is hidden under layers of denial and rationalization. They may feel a sudden sense of anger or a compelling urge to minimize the other person's importance. They may convince themselves that the relationship never really mattered, but these are defenses, mechanisms, trying to suppress the rising emotional residue of their earliest relational injuries. This activation of old wounds during no contact is particularly confusing for the avoidant because they are not emotionally literate with their own pain. They were never taught to sit with discomfort or to name their feelings. So when sadness or fear arises, it often gets misread as boredom, annoyance, or even physical restlessness. They may experience tension in the body, shallow breathing, disrupted sleep, or vague sensations of loss that they cannot trace. They are haunted by a feeling, but disconnected from its source. This is the unconscious at work, pulling up layers of unmet need that the conscious mind has long tried to forget. Relationships have a way of exposing the wounds that went unnoticed for years, and when those relationships are interrupted by no contact, the psyche seizes the opportunity to reintroduce the pain it has carried all along. The avoidant doesn't choose this confrontation, it chooses them, and in many cases, they resist it with every defense they've developed, but even in resistance, the wound begins to speak. It speaks through dreams, intrusive thoughts, and emotional numbing. It speaks through the discomfort that grows with each passing day of silence. No contact is not simply a relational strategy. It is an unconscious invitation to return to the original break, the first fracture between self and other, where the avoidant decided it was safer not to need anyone at all. That belief now feels less like a shield and more like a scar, and although they may try to bury it again, something has already begun to awaken. The avoidant builds their life around the belief that distance is safety. Emotional walls are not just habits, they are survival strategies rooted in early conditioning. These walls help them navigate the world without becoming overwhelmed by the vulnerability that relationships demand. In the presence of another person who genuinely tries to connect, these defenses often activate automatically. Withdrawal, sarcasm, indifference, or intellectualization become the means through which they regulate their discomfort. But when no contact begins, something unexpected starts to happen. The defenses that once felt like protection begin to feel more like confinement. The silence strips away the usual rituals of avoidance. There is no one left to push away, no one to monitor, no emotional proximity to manage. The avoidant is left alone in the space they once craved, and in that space the emotional walls start to reveal their cost. At first, this experience may not register as suffering. It may appear as a form of control, peace, or autonomy. They might relish the quiet, the absence of emotional demands, the predictability of solitude. But with time, an uncomfortable realization creeps in. What was once perceived as freedom now feels like disconnection. The same walls that shielded them from intimacy are now keeping out warmth, understanding, and human contact. This awareness does not crash down suddenly. It emerges in subtle moments, when they notice the absence of shared laughter, the stillness of a phone that no longer lights up, or the quiet ache in their chest when a memory catches them off guard. The fortress begins to echo. Inside that fortress, the avoidant faces a paradox. Their defenses worked so well that they lost sight of what it feels like to truly be seen and accepted. Now, in the wake of no contact, there is no one to mirror them back to themselves, no one to offer soft confrontation or hold emotional space. This absence brings them face to face with the loneliness they've long denied. For the first time in a while, they begin to feel the emptiness that their detachment created. It's not just that they miss someone, it's that they miss the possibility of being emotionally close without fear. And even if they won't admit it aloud, even if they mask it with cold logic or denial, a subtle mourning begins. They mourn not just the person, but the parts of themselves they had to suppress to maintain distance. They mourn the vulnerability they never allowed, the softness they buried, the emotional intimacy they feared yet longed for. The wall that once kept pain out now keeps healing away. In this realization, the avoidant is confronted with the deepest irony of their pattern. In trying to protect themselves, they became imprisoned by their own defenses. The silence of no contact magnifies this internal reality. It acts like a mirror, reflecting not strength, but fear, not freedom, but isolation. And in this isolation, a longing emerges, not just for the other, but for the lost ability to feel close and safe in the presence of another human being. When the avoidant enters no contact, One of their first instincts is to regain control, not of the relationship, but of the narrative within their own mind. Control becomes their refuge, a cognitive stronghold that keeps chaos at bay. They tell themselves it's better this way, that emotional detachment is maturity, that the other person was too needy, too dramatic, too dependent. These rationalizations don't arise from clarity, but from a deep need to suppress the discomfort that's beginning to stir beneath the surface. They create a mental fortress out of logic and idealized independence, and in that fortress, they begin to fantasize, not in a romantic sense, but in a psychological one. Fantasies of being unaffected, of thriving without connection, of being above emotional entanglement begin to take shape. These illusions grant them a temporary sense of stability. They help them believe that the bond wasn't as deep as it felt, that their emotional disconnection is proof of strength, not trauma. But the unconscious has its own rhythm, and it does not honor the ego's story. As the days go on, the thoughts they tried to suppress begin to return. At first it may be as simple as remembering the sound of the other person's laughter, or the way their presence softened a room. Then it deepens, memories, specific moments, unresolved conversations. The avoidant doesn't intend to dwell, but the mind no longer obeys their control. The very act of resisting emotional vulnerability begins to collapse. What was once a deliberate separation now feels like a wound they can't see but keep touching. Their internal monologue becomes filled with contradictions. They may think, "I didn't really care," followed quickly by, "Why can't I stop thinking about them?" The fantasy of being unaffected begins to unravel as obsessive thoughts sneak in through the cracks. They start reanalyzing everything, the final words exchanged, the silences, the unspoken emotions. They question whether they were too harsh, too distant, too unwilling to compromise. They may replay the last interaction 100 times in their mind, looking for evidence that they didn't push away someone who mattered. This obsessive reflection isn't driven by sentimentality, but by an unconscious urge to make sense of their emotional disorientation. The avoidant begins to experience internal friction between who they believe they are and what they are now feeling. The fantasies of control become exhausting to maintain, because they are at odds with the grief, confusion, and vulnerability beginning to surface. In this mental loop, the avoidant feels both powerless and ashamed. They want to retreat further, to regain the numbness that once protected them. But something has changed. The person they kept at arm's length is now embedded in their thoughts, and this preoccupation challenges the story they've long told themselves, that they are better off emotionally detached. They're left with the unsettling realization that emotional distance does not equate to emotional freedom, and the attempt to control the narrative only reveals how deeply affected they truly are. As the days of no contact stretch into weeks, the avoidant, who once took pride in emotional independence, finds themselves caught in a silent confrontation with the self, without the presence of the other person to push against, to retreat from, or to blame. They are left alone with their own reflection. At first they may resist it, throwing themselves into distractions, reaffirming their belief that distance is safety, and convincing themselves that they are fine. But silence has a way of dissolving illusions slowly. The more they try to detach, the more they begin to sense a growing discomfort, not rooted in the relationship itself, but in something deeper. The emotional reactions they believed they were above, regret, longing, confusion, begin to creep into their thoughts, demanding attention. And with them comes the unsettling question that they can no longer avoid: why does this keep happening? This question is the beginning of a quiet identity crisis. The avoidant begins to realize that their behaviors are not isolated incidents, but patterns repeating themselves across relationships. Each attempt to connect inevitably ends in withdrawal. Each offer of intimacy is eventually rejected, not because the other person failed, but because the avoidant felt overwhelmed by vulnerability. No contact removes all external conflict and leaves only the internal landscape, now echoing with these recurring themes. They start to wonder if the very way they relate to others is built on a foundation of fear, not choice. And in that moment, the self-image they've maintained begins to fracture. The stories they told themselves about being better off alone, about others being too emotional or needy, begin to feel hollow. They realize these stories were not truths, but shields, created long ago to protect against early wounds that were never acknowledged. What once looked like control now feels like avoidance. What once seemed like maturity now feels like fear masquerading as detachment. The avoidant starts to see glimpses of the shadow self, the part of them they have disowned, the one that feels, needs and longs for connection, but was taught that these feelings were dangerous or weak. This confrontation is not comfortable. It brings shame, confusion, and a deep sense of being lost. They may not speak of it to anyone. They may still appear composed, but inside, they are wrestling with a new awareness that their identity as emotionally self-sufficient might not be a truth but a mask. This is the call for integration, not in a dramatic, transformative way, but as a slow, painful invitation to reevaluate how they relate to love, connection, and the self. They begin to feel the weight of emotional walls that no longer serve them and the cost of pushing away those who offered genuine intimacy. The longer they sit with this realization, the more they sense that healing won't come from further detachment, but from facing the very vulnerability they have spent a lifetime avoiding. In that space of quiet reckoning, a new self may begin to emerge, one not defined by distance, but by the courage to feel what they've long feared. No contact doesn't free the avoidant, it exposes the very emptiness they've been running from all along.